Okay, so this is the second part of the sort of mini lecture to make up for class missed on November 11th of 2008. And so this is about not Little Red Riding Hood, but the other set of fairy tales you read for this week, Beauty and the Beast. And in my assignment, I asked you to talk about morals that you saw in those tales, because it's something that's fairly common to try to sort of find a moral in a fairy tale. And so I chose the Beauty and the Beast ones for you to do that because it's a fairly complex notion in those tales. I mean, we have the traditional Beauty and the Beast, the one by Beaumont, which we know a little bit from like the Disney adaptation of Beauty and the Beast. It's not an exact adaptation, but it's similar to the Beaumont version, where we have the beautiful woman who falls in love with the Beast despite his horrible looks or what have you, and then is rewarded in the end after she pledges her love and finds out that he's actually a handsome prince who had been cursed until he could find someone to love him. And so in that one, the moral is relatively straightforward, which is to be kind and virtuous, and you will be rewarded. So nothing too ground shattering there or anything like that. But when we look at some of the other versions, the other variants, we see that notion has not always been so straightforward, and is oftentimes really problematic. So the versions of some of the stories like the Pig King, for instance, where we have a protagonist who looks like a pig, and even though he can shed his pig skin when he wants to, he doesn't, and instead continues with his pig-like behaviors, murders two women, marries two sisters, and marries their other sister, and because she doesn't have it in for him or anything like that, he lets her live, and they sort of get on happily. So it's a little strange because neither of those two seem to deserve what they get. I mean, it's a little strange for Meldina to forgive the man who killed both of her sisters, and she also pledges to him that she won't tell his secret, but she does tell his secret to the queen. So she is not living up to her word. He's a murderer, but they live happily ever after. A little odd. Not so much in the sort of logical, moral kind of thing like the Beauty and the Beast story. So a very different sort of a variant. And then we have the Frog King story, another one that is very odd, in that we have this young girl, the king's youngest daughter, who makes a promise to this frog so that he'll give her toy back, but then immediately goes back on her promise. She doesn't keep her promise until the king enforces it and makes her accept the frog and let him eat off of her plate and sleep in her room, in her bed, as she promised. So she's not willing to do that on her own. It's only because someone else makes her do it, and her disgust for the frog is never hidden. So much so that the transformation in that case has nothing to do with her deciding that she loves him despite his frogginess. It's when he says, you said I could sleep on your pillow. Come on, let me on. That she picks up his slimy body and slams it into a wall as hard as she can. And that's what makes him transform. There's no rhyme or reason to that. I mean, I don't know why that makes him transform, but it does. At which point he turns into this handsome young king, whose servant shows up not long after. But, you would think that... So he might wonder whether he's making a good choice, whether this woman that who has not behaved well is the best choice to be his queen. But he doesn't do that. There's not a sort of straightforward logic to the story, which is one of the things that makes it, sometimes a little a little confusing, a little frustrating for readers of fairy tales, because there isn't a kind of straightforward logic to the things that happen. So what happens then is that we see that sometimes the kind of cultural logic of these stories doesn't make sense to us. They don't. The things that happen don't necessarily make us go, oh yeah, that makes sense. They don't. It doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. But we should recognize when that happens, when we see that, it's like, well, that's weird, because the good people don't get what they deserve necessarily. It's like sort of nasty people get the good stuff. When we see that, we need to recognize it as a sort of indication of the way that particular ideals have been imposed on the stories. So it's not because the story itself, should have a moral that makes sense to us. It was probably originated at a time when the stories were being circulated primarily as, the saying says, as old wives' tales, as tales told among women in usually domestic situations, so like in the kitchen, for instance. And not necessarily things that, because they're designed for children, they ought to have a particular lesson for everyone to learn from. That was imposed, in the mostly in the later 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries onto fairy tales as they became part of the world of children. So that, things that were told to children, suddenly it became important that they teach them particular lessons. And so that's why, these stories sometimes, strike us as being very odd. And that's a good indicator that the story is probably from a time period prior to those tales being part of the realm of children. The final thing that I wanted to say was about the ways that these stories are acting as a kind of diffuser for social tensions. Right? There's a tension obvious around marriage somehow that's happening in these stories. So they could alleviate some of the fears that someone might have if they were, suddenly told, oh, I have to marry some person that I don't even know, who seems like quite a beast to me. Then this kind of a story could relieve some of those fears, because you're no longer how do I say that? No longer sort of thinking about this real person, but you're thinking maybe about the potential that they won't be a beast. In fact, they might be really great instead. So this could be a way of addressing some of those fears or tensions. So that's what I have to say about these, and I'm enjoying reading what you have to say about them, and I'm sorry we didn't get to talk sort of face to face about them, but that's what happens sometimes. Enjoy your week, and I'll see you soon.